By the time I was 8 years old, it was pretty clear that the majority of my personality for the foreseeable future was just going to be books. And arguably the person most excited about this fact was my dad, who also made a portion of his personality just books, and thus had a very easy way to try to bond with me as his eldest. So what did he decide was the best way to start our mutual love of book bonding? Having me read one of his favorite books of all time, of course. And there's only one problem with that. His favorite book of all time is The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. For those who don't know, this is the third novella in the Sherlock Holmes canon, the fifth in the canon order, whether you go by publication date or chronological order. It's usually considered to be the best of the entire series as well, which is pretty high up there, right? So maybe a stellar choice. But also, I don't know if any of you have ever interacted with a reading-heavy 8-year-old before, but my dad never considered that for a second, just maybe, I wasn't quite at the age to appreciate this classic of mystery literature. But, well, 8-year-old me found out very quickly that I was not ready for it. 8-year-old me did not get past chapter 1, which is entirely focused on a walking stick. At the time, I barely grasped what they were talking about. I was just confused and bored, had no idea why some random stick was so important to these people I didn't know, didn't care about. My dad, however, never really gave up on the thought of me reading this, and about 10 years later, I was transitioning into college, was getting a degree in English. Perfect time, right? I should be at the perfect age to appreciate this. So he gifted me 3 copies of his 3 favorite books of all time. Hound of the Baskervilles was among them. And I was, willing to take another stab at it. I made 2 more attempts to read it through college and shortly after graduation, and I still failed to make it much further than chapter 2. Cut to about a month ago, I'm craving a shorter book, a classic maybe of some kind. Well, I still have this copy of Hound of the Baskervilles laying around. Dad's birthday's around the corner, so I'm feeling a little sentimental. Let's give it another shot. I consumed it promptly in 2 days. So yeah, it's safe to say I've come to the conclusion that Sherlock Holmes is actually good. Who could have foreseen this? My dad has been gloating about it ever since. Some of the real shock from this conclusion, though, comes from the form of experiencing a piece of literature that up to this point I only had a surface-level pop culture understanding of. This comes from fun facts from my Sherlock-obsessed dads over the years, that one chapter I couldn't stand, a few episodes of House MD, and that 1H Bomber Guy video. And when you go to read a classic that has become such a feature of pop culture in a way that the Holmes as a canon has, I think that there's always going to be something new to discover that gets lost in the literal century of adaptations that have come since the original stories were published. Let's say, for example, that it's one of the more well-known things of the stories that they were all written from Dr. John Watson's point of view. He serves as the POV character for us to experience Holmes through. It's a lens of an everyman that an audience could project onto. And that's not uncommon to find in some other classic pieces of literature from around that time. Move up a few decades and you get The Great Gatsby as an example. But, well, was anyone gonna tell me that Watson is actually just the full-on protagonist? And that he probably has more of a noticeable impact on the case as a whole than Holmes does in this specific story? Apparently not. So, in this rant disguised as a video essay, there are going to be spoilers about the Hound of the Baskervilles, specifically some pieces in particular that surprised me and that are key to the structure of the story as a whole, which could affect how you experience the mystery in general if you haven't read it. While I won't be going into who actually did the crime at the heart of this story, other things about the ending will come up, so consider this a warning. You should have read this when it came out, like 100 years ago. If you didn't want to be spoiled, loser, where were you? The edition that I'm using for this mess of thoughts that you could possibly call an analysis is the Digireads paperback edition published in 2016. Full ISBN is in the description for those who want to follow along with the exact edition at home, like a nerd. Alright, to some people it might not be fair to say that this was a surprise that Watson was actually just the protagonist, but thinking of protagonist versus a POV character, I have a very different image in mind of what we're expecting. A POV character I'm expecting to be more almost like set dressing. You know, we hear Watson all the time as this character who is there to ask questions, not necessarily participate in the investigation and the solving of this mystery that's at stake here, right? He is there to frame Holmes, not the other way around. But considering how the story is structured, I don't think that there's any way that you could say that he serves any other narrative function than that of the protagonist. For one thing, Holmes isn't there for most of it. Like 60 pages of this 120-page novella, Holmes is not there. He's not part of that investigation. He's just gone. After Mortimer presents the case to Holmes and Watson regarding the mysterious death of his former friend, Charles Baskerville, and the concern about his only heir, Henry, who's about to make a trip out to the estate he's inherited, Holmes shows interest, as he does, and as they're making plans to all travel together to the countryside estate to investigate this matter further, Holmes decides, nah, just got too much happening in London to leave right this moment. So Watson, you're on your own. Go off, get some clues, report back. So for half of this Sherlock Holmes book, we don't have any Sherlock Holmes. What in the world are we doing? How is this where we're starting? I absolutely flabbergasted me. I'm not gonna lie. Especially if you're going into this thinking that Watson is just your POV framing character. Now, Holmes does eventually come back into the story in a scene that is probably one of my favorites of all time, if only because it can be boiled down to, "My dear Watson, please don't shoot me." I honestly can't remember a time I cackled so hard out loud while reading in a book, out of shock. So while I'll spend most of this video trying to defend Watson and his place in the story, that is not to say that Holmes is not an interesting character who isn't worthy of having gotten all the pop culture hype and literary acclaim over the years. He's absolutely a fantastic character, a total mad lad, but Watson does deserve some flowers for carrying at least half of this book without like any Holmes around at all. And in a way, the beginning of the story preps us as readers to have this investigation done by Watson, not Holmes. That's right, 8-year-old me. Stick involved, actually important. Also flabbergasting. Now, one may be confused as to how the first chapter, literally named Mr. Sherlock Holmes, serves to better introduce us to Watson, but bear with me here. Throughout the other stories, you'll see Watson do little tests on Holmes towards the beginning, at least the ones I've gotten so far. Take the watch from the Sign of Four as an example. In this case, Holmes, however, flips the structure, asking Watson to examine a walking stick that was left behind in their parlor to see if they can figure out something about the owner that had not gotten to speak with them yet. And Watson, who's been friends with Sherlock for years at this point, as well as being an intelligent man in his own right, does fairly well. He's able to correctly deduce that the walking stick belongs to a well-respected doctor, likely one that lives and works in the countryside, but he's wrong in assuming that a local hunt is the one that gifted the stick based off the initials carved into it. It is Sherlock who confirms the first 2 points and leads Watson to the correct answer on the third, finding that it was actually another hospital that the doctor worked at that gave the stick. This is validated later by a medical directory that they happen to have on hand, because of course they do. But what we're getting here is a demonstration not just of Holmes' deduction skills, it's of Watson's. This is a very Watson-centric scene. It's Watson who gives the initial evaluation, Watson who is proven right on his first counts, and it's Watson's test, frankly. Literally, flat out blank, Holmes is testing Watson. This isn't about Holmes' skills. By this point, you're expected to already know about Holmes' skills. Even if you're going into this with just that pop culture surface knowledge, you kind of have this idea of Holmes as a genius already stepping in. And here as readers, what we're seeing is Watson's abilities on page. We're seeing information that we can then later put on to an investigation of a larger scale. That he can be trusted to provide some accurate information, maybe have a few theories that can get us into the right direction, but that there's also something that's going to be a little bit off. He can only be trusted so much. You can get 2/3 of the way there, but we need someone else to take that last push to solve the actual mystery. Presumably Holmes in this case. And, well, that's kind of how things play out when the stakes are higher. Watson's solo investigation gives trails for Holmes to later use to piece everything together. And it gives the reader the best information possible to put things together, because we are knowing and trusting the information that Watson is providing. We can then try to make our own theories themselves, similar to how Holmes would, seeing the information at a slightly different length than Watson does. But arguably, that trust only works if you have that first scene as well, because Watson is doing most of the investigational work. You can only trust that his information is accurate if you see him providing an accurate analysis earlier on. It is giving essentially a base level trust in reader expectation with your protagonist and their skills and what they can provide in terms of the later events of the story. And I think that it's like so baked into the structure that it's so easy when you look back and you're like, how could we have foreseen that Watson was going to be the core of this, that Holmes wasn't going to be involved? I mean, it was right there. He was the one mostly involved in chapter 1. You should have seen it from the beginning, you dummy. I don't know. I didn't, apparently. But so far we have a story that's structuring itself from the beginning around Watson as a character. It's using the first chapters to set up himself, his skills. He's the only one of the dynamic duo that's present for the entire story, and arguably the one to do most of the investigational work that Holmes has to rely on later to make the final, solution come to play, right? But I think that there's one really big thing that actually seals Watson as a protagonist, as the Hound of the Baskervilles is Watson's story. And that has to deal with the stakes in the case of the motivations of our two potential protagonists. For Holmes, his interest in a case has to do more with the core mystery. He's intrigued by the death of Charles Baskerville due to the circumstances. There's this idea of a curse that's led to the downfall of many Baskerville men. There's the fact that Baskerville was already paranoid leading up to his death and yet went out alone in the dark to a place where the curse was most likely to befall him. And there are very limited witnesses, and all the ones that saw it could have reasonable motivations for wanting the man dead. There wasn't an obvious wound, and the cause of death is pretty much a heart attack, which would typically rule out murder as an option, but there's still all these other suspicious circumstances around it. And not to mention that Holmes is just very much a skeptic. The idea of disproving that this was caused by some curse would be tantalizing. This all makes sense for him as a detective, and is plenty to serve as motivation for Holmes with taking on most of his cases. He's just curious about a puzzle. He needs to solve it. By the end of the story, after a few weeks pass, we get the last bit of details needed to wrap up loose ends with a conversation between Holmes, Watson, Mortimer, and Henry. And by that point, Holmes has kind of lost interest. He's been working on a new case, and it's taking up space in his brain where the Baskerville murder was previously taking up space. And when asked to give more details about some of the stuff happening with the murder from his memory, Holmes essentially says that, he couldn't care less. Quote, "Certainly, though I cannot guarantee that I carry all the facts in my mind. Each of my cases displaces the last. Tomorrow, some other little problem may be submitted to my notice, which will in turn dispossess the fair French lady in the infamous Upwood." He then ends the conversation 2 pages later saying, "That's enough work talk. Wanna go get dinner?" Even though they've barely gotten to the Q&A part of this discussion. It is fascinating. He just full on admits to forgetting about these cases that he becomes so intrinsically involved in. Barely a few weeks after they're over, and ends it by saying, "Do you want to go get some food?" That's just how the book ends. Book cuts off right after that. It's done. But Holmes doesn't care, right? Because the problem is solved, so why should he? His investment is only in the mystery. If the mystery is done, there's nothing to keep him attached to the going-ons of the people involved. He doesn't take on the case because of the people affected. He takes it because of the circumstances of it. It's too interesting for his brain to pass up in that brief moment. And I think that it's worth mentioning, as it becomes a common part of other pieces of the canon, that Holmes doesn't foresee himself failing. He plans to solve his puzzle and move on. No matter how unsolvable this case seems to be at first glance, he has the utmost confidence in his abilities, as do the people around him. The idea that there would be consequences for failure just doesn't occur to him. The motivation that he can only really stick with is that he needs to solve a puzzle in his brain. So for him to be invested, he has to just think that the mystery is worth pondering on for a little bit longer. Any other stakes involved to give the story, say, more emotional investment for a reader, they have to come from somewhere else, because if the mystery no longer is interesting, or it gets solved before the climax, which arguably in this case it does, why are we still here? Holmes doesn't seem to think we should be. In this particular case, there are stakes outside of the mystery needing to be solved, because there's a pressure, there's a time frame involved. Charles Baskerville has an heir. He has Henry. If there was a murder, which is not particularly clear at the start, then Henry's at stake of being the next victim once he goes to claim his new estate. And maybe as a reader you can find that your own personal code of ethics would be enough to give you that emotional connection to the story that would keep you invested if you just don't want an innocent man who traveled to a whole new continent to claim not just riches, but a responsibility from a title that he inherited in 19th century England. You don't want him to die. But as a writer, I still think it's kind of important that the main character have a similar level of investment in the story at large, right? Your main character is your world in a way. He's your guide. He's the person that is telling the reader what to give a shit about. And I think the investment of a protagonist or main character in a story sometimes matters a little bit more than a reader, because that can affect how a reader views a actual stake in a way. And while Holmes may not have some sort of emotional involvement or long-standing motivation that might pursue him to continue on with the mystery even if it no longer is interesting or fascinating, Watson sure does. He's attached to Henry as a person. They become friends over the course of the case, with Watson and Henry pretty much bonding over a shared fear for their lives and their new surroundings, left without their usual safety nets. Watson, he does his best to wingman for Henry with one of the local women in the area, despite her, we'll say, brother's attempts at intervening, which, true bro behavior in the moment, despite how that plotline goes. So while I'm not going to say that Holmes doesn't care about his clients at all, I don't think that we can rely on his sole motivations in the narrative to have the sort of pressure that's there. The pressure of what happens when they fail is only really felt by Watson. Watson's the one with an emotional investment, and it's him who's doing the bulk of the investigation, and it's him who is not infallible. He is not the genius Sherlock Holmes, but a flawed pupil doing his best to emulate the master at work. There's a chance of him failing when he is alone, and he has something to fight for. A friend's life is on the line should he not get the most information he can to provide Holmes, or if he can't protect Henry should the culprit decide to act again, or if he can't figure out some pieces fast enough. Holmes' strong sense of needing to see a puzzle to its completion will motivate him to the end of the case, but it's Watson's emotional connection that will not only motivate him to the end of the case, but give the reader an idea that there's consequence. Without Watson, I think you could argue that the stakes are meaningless. Watson is giving the story a reason to care outside of there just being, in general, a problem to solve. because a lot of books have a problem to solve. Why do we care about this one? And I think it's that key of him giving such a huge narrative purpose as to why we care, why we're still here, why we're reading this to its completion even after the problem is finished. That gives him the idea that he is the protagonist. He is the key part of the story. He's what's holding it together. Now, these may just be the mad ramblings of a gummy worm who, in a haze of a weekend, came to the shocking conclusion that The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is one of, if not arguably the best of the Sherlock Holmes canon, is a good book. But I do think that the way that Watson is woven into the structure of this narrative was done with just such intent that it's impossible to ignore, and I feel like it has been, in terms of our understanding of Holmes of a canon in the greater world at large. Like, those who haven't read the books themselves may not really understand. And I think it's also very telling that The Hound of the Baskervilles was the first of the Sherlock stories to be published as part of the mainline canon after the character was killed. That this character that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle tried to get rid of makes his grand return to the page, but instead we get Watson taking center stage. Holmes is barely in it, and it's still credited as one of the highest ranking stories by fans over a century later. And I think that just goes to show that it's time that Watson gets his flowers too, for being a character that makes this story as iconic as it is. Without him, well, we barely have one. So yeah, maybe I'm just ranting about a book that I'm 100 years late to the party on, and maybe all these points have already been made and I'm just really out of the loop on Sherlock Holmes discourse, as I probably am. But I don't know. I don't think Doyle would mind if Watson got a little bit more love than some of our surface level pop culture knowledge on these characters often leaves us to give him. Also, just what a flex to come back almost 10 years after killing off a character you hated with what might be your best work and have that character literally only be involved in half the story. Like, props to Doyle on that one. You really showed all those fans clamoring for more Sherlock content that he wasn't all that he cracked up to be without Watson, huh? Now, there is one lingering problem. You see, I'm kind of stuck here. I can't get this story out of my head. Watson, Holmes, even the way that this mystery was just crafted and written, it's an obsession. If you couldn't tell by the fact that I've dedicated however long this ends up being, like, taking me to do to get my thoughts out on. But here I am. I'm at the finish line of this video, and I'm still not really satisfied. So, what's a gummy worm to do? Upend all my planned reading goals for the year to read the entirety of the mainline canon, of course. It's the only solution. I can't stop this growing obsession with a particular property until I consume everything I can of it. Obviously, the only option. Just thank all the gods for Libby and the public library's selection of always available classic ebooks, or else my wallet would have real problems. Now, I have started my Sherlock Holmes journey a little out of order, but I think we're gonna keep up some discoveries regardless. This time, we're gonna try to go through publication order as it was intended, though, you know, maybe I have more of a handle on what makes these stories as iconic as they are. You know, I've read one. I think some of the bulk of the shock value of just how entertaining they can be will wear down, right? So preamble aside, I think it's time I get started with the story that started this all, Study in Scarlet. What in the world are Mormons doing here?